Okay, thank you. I apologise for playing around with the order of the dishes, but people are being very engaged and that's making it run longer, and I have childcare responsibilities to run off too. So I've jumped the queue to talk about the curious case of the Muslim militant and the Chinese gynecologist. I will come back to the title to explain it shortly. To say a little bit of background about this, my work for the past 15 years or so has been looking at the political economy of violent conflict in developing countries, particularly focusing on the relationship between inequality and processes of political mobilization and violence. And this talk comes out of a kind of hard-thinking retrospective I had on the basis of two separate sets of research I was involved in a few years ago. The first was a set of a bit of field work we did in a city called Poso in Indonesia, which had seen massive Christian-Muslim violence in the wake of the fall of Suharto. By some estimates, several thousand people killed, really gruesome violence happening as part of that. And we went along in the immediate aftermath of that violence to do some field work. And for the entire period we were in Poso, it was just after the main violence had broken down or had stopped. We had to get all kinds of police permits, home office security permits. My university at the time had to pay £5,000 a day insurance for us to be there. And to be honest, the whole time I was there, I was shitting myself. Sorry. But the first night we were there, the Muslim militia group turned up at the door of the hotel and they said to us, well, listen, we know that you're the one hotel that was still operating, and they said, we know that you're Christians. I wasn't going to stick my hand up and say I'm an atheist, I'm not that stupid. But we know you're Christians, and we know you're probably worried, but it's fine. We're actually here to look out for you. And they sort of gave us that kind of mafia hug that, you know, is that something you value or not? And eventually we met and interviewed the guy who was well known amongst this community to have been the main instigator on the Muslim side of the violence. There was instigation on both sides, but on the Muslim side. And the first thing he said to us was, look, I know you're Christian, and I know you're worried, but you don't have to worry, because I don't hate you. It's those Christians up in Tentena that I hate. That's important for what we come back to. The second set of research which fed into this rethinking was some interviews I was doing in a much more genteel setting amongst Pentecostal Christians in Kuala Lumpur. So over the water in Malaysia, very much more wealthy. Pentecostal Christians tend to be very wealthy, middle-class professionals. I picked gynecology mainly because it was funny, but there was a gynecologist, but many other professionals mixed amongst this group. And we were talking with them about what it meant to be Christian to them in Malaysia and what it meant particularly for their sense of citizenship. And in a really unfortunate kind of natural experiment, in the middle of doing these interviews, the Anders Breivik massacre happened in Norway when the far-right extremists killed, I think, over 100 people at a political youth camp in Norway. And the response of this community that we were working with was astonishing. The line that we got time and again, not consistently, but more regularly than I like to admit, was, we disapprove of what he did, but we understand why he did it. So I'm going to come back to that in a minute, because it got me thinking about the narratives about the rise of religious violence. And the field that I work in, a lot of what we do as particularly development economists looking at ethnic conflict and identity conflict is we often actually try to explain away the identity dimension of it. And I've often thought increasingly when you look at sort of sociology of developing countries, we try to understand racism. But when we look at developed countries, we try to understand racism as something in itself. But when we look at developing countries, we try to explain it away. And we say, oh, it's because of inequality, as I've been part of a project, or it's because of political marginalization. And these are undoubtedly important issues, but I think we may sometimes have gone too far to explaining away the identity dimensions of violence. But within the mainstream academic and political narratives about the rise of religious violence we see at the moment, there are two main sort of themes. The first is what we call the clash of civilizations, and many people might be familiar with this. attributed to Samuel Huntington, who in the wake of the Cold War in 1993 said basically ideological wars are over, but that doesn't mean there's going to be the end of history, as Francis Fukuyama said. No, what we're going to see is the rise of civilizational conflict. And you can see from this quote that by civilizations he basically meant religions. Now, this is a quote from a guy called Edward Said, 25 years previously, in his book Orientalism, very well-known book, looking at the sort of the discourse of race and racism during British colonialism. And I was struck by the parallel between these two. But just in case you're missing the point, this one is sarcasm. This one, 25 years later, is not. But nobody really takes the Clash of Civilizations thesis seriously within academia anymore. It's still a very powerful political narrative, but within academia it's not taken seriously. But the mainstream narrative we have now is this idea about religious violence being kind of globalization's discontent. That with globalization, communities are feeling marginalized, they're feeling left out of the mainstream development, they're often feeling culturally marginalized by watching, the import of American television shows on satellite TV, which you can now watch in the long houses in the middle of the Sarawak rainforest. And that this marginalization and resentment has driven people to fundamentalism and to violent fundamentalism in reaction. And here's two quotes from two scholars associated with this idea, Mark Duffield, Mary Caldor, and another quote, one of the big names in this who I haven't got a quote from, but makes similar arguments, Mark Juergensmeyer. But this, to me, clashed with my Muslim militant and my Chinese gynecologist. Because actually, although they were both expressing religious hatreds, dislikes, the guy who was marginalized, the guy who was part of a marginalized community, the Muslim militant, who was very much out of the mainstream development of Indonesia, he was the one who was seeing his conflict as being a local fight with local people unabashedly about control over the city resources and the city power. And it was actually the modern Pentecostal Christians, many of whom educated in the West, many of whom probably got families living in Perth, many Chinese Malaysians do, right? These were the ones who were expressing this kind of globalization, global discourse about civilizations and religions. So it didn't seem to fit. So this set me off to look about in more depth at these kinds of narratives about globalization and religious conflict. And I thought, well, the first question to ask is the unchallenged question in all of this: is religious conflict on the rise? And when you look at these people talking about religion and conflict, what you often see is that you see a conflict that is fought along religious lines, but also along other lines, being reinterpreted as a religious conflict. And the classic example to me is the Sri Lankan Civil War, which has been going on, well, it came to an end a few years ago, but it started in 1983, and nobody talked about this as a religious conflict. Certainly, the Tamils were mostly Hindu, and the Sinhalese were mostly Buddhist, although with a substantial Christian minority. And if you want to see any religious conflict in Sri Lanka, then it's probably between the Christian and the Buddhist Sinhalese, rather than the Tamil Tamil Sinhalese. But when you look at the way this is now being reinterpreted in the arguments and debates about religious conflict, it has suddenly become a religious conflict, because it fits this narrative about the rise of religious conflict. So with a co-author a few years ago, I'd done a study looking at the econometric study of civil war. And there's a big industry around this, looking at trying to identify the correlates of civil war. And one of the things that often gets put into this is demographic variables. Is this a homogenous country? Is it a divided country? And we'd argued that these studies pile everything into one. They don't take account of time. So what we did was they sort of tend to start with 1945 or 1960 and end with 2005. So we looked instead at a kind of a rolling window to see whether there were changes over time in the correlates of conflict. And our initial study, we'd looked at ethnic diversity, and we found, that's the top two lines, that when you look at two main indicators of ethnic diversity, you find that it was a strong predictor of the incidence of conflict in the sort of years beginning the 1960s and 1970s, but had fallen out of significance by more recent periods. When we then repeated this for looking at religion more recently, we found that actually religious diversity has been consistently negatively correlated with violent conflict, and that since the 1980s, that's been a statistically significant negative correlation. So actually these bottom two lines, below 0, dropping below the -2, which is a rough indicator of statistical significance, you can see that these bottom two lines suggest that the more religiously diverse countries are, holding for all other kinds of variables, the less likely they seem to be to go into conflict. So then what about this globalization? Well, having decried pooling everything together, when we start looking at globalization, we actually have to pull it all back together just because of the data paucities. But I did a study, and I'm not going to bore you too much with the econometric details, but I will be around for questions if people want to ask. We then looked at indicators of globalization and looked at them both by themselves and interacted with the religious diversity variables. And again, we found a consistently negative picture. Very rarely, actually, we tried various specifications, and very rarely did you have any statistical significance, but where you did, it was negative. So the statistical picture we were picking up was, short of there being a rise of religious conflict, actually there seems to be a decline in religious conflict. The conflicts we see around the world are much more religious, or rather we see much more religious conflict, partly through this reinterpretation and partly because undoubtedly they seem more real to us because ISIS and things like this are more immediate to us. But that actually the statistical trend is away from religious violence, and particularly globalization doesn't seem to be having that incrementing impact. If anything, it has a diminishing impact. So what are the alternative stories? Well, I have alternative areas that we're exploring now through a series of case studies, and we're very much in the process of doing this research, so I'd be happy to answer questions about it. But the basic hypothesis we are working with is looking at how conflicts transform themselves into an identity basis, and particularly how they very often become religiously oriented. And what we're finding and suggesting is that you can actually see this as the series of a set of micro-level outcomes within the processes of mobilizing resources, looking for allies internationally, looking for funding, and also very often internal contestation for control, which leads to the shifting of conflicts from being based around kind of resource conflicts to emphasizing the religious dimension of the conflict. And I will end there.